you very much. It's always great to see agencies, funders taking up integration directly into their own programming. So now we come to the second part of the seminar today, and I would like to invite all of our presenters and speakers also to come up to the stage. I mean, actually, you can just take a seat right here. And we are opening for questions and answers. And please just raise your hand and also introduce yourself before you ask a question. And I believe we have a microphone that is going to come to you when you raise your hand. So are there any questions that were, that you were thinking about while listening to any of the presenters today?
Brian Greenberg, I'm an independent consultant. There was so much to think about in these presentations, really enjoyed them. One of the questions I have, I was hoping one or more of you might be interested in reacting to, is, well, first I wanted to say that Elizabeth's presentation got me thinking about how we might approach the gender issues, and it would seem to me, and I'm sure this is part of your understanding as well, that you got to engage men and boys. It's not just working with women to improve outcomes for them, especially in the realm of negotiation. Got to work with men and boys to try and push values and norm changes. And thinking about that got me wondering how we deal with the, if you will, the drag that can be imposed by culturally appropriate as a frame, which of course I don't mean to dismiss for a moment. Culturally appropriate is important, but at the same time we need to acknowledge that we are frontally changing cultures in some ways, and that we accept and expect cultural changes of various kinds. And nowhere is this clearer than in the gender domain and in the food and diet domains, where people will be, in the future especially, asked to make changes in their diet. These are things that we engage pretty readily, yet we're changing fundamental cultural precepts. If we were to engage that a little more, it seems to me that first, we'd be working with social scientists a lot, because we need to know what culturally appropriate really means before we can then respond appropriately. And maybe our current sector divisions, technical thematic divisions, aren't emphasizing that as they might. So if we were to bring that perspective on, we might be less daunted by disciplinary boundaries. And the challenge of cross-cutting gender into all of these things, which is something we really need to think about. How do we train professionals and in our education to be ready to grapple with gender if we say it's cross-cutting and they're working in a particular sector?
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question in the room? Okay, please.
Hi, I'm Julie Howard. I'm a senior advisor with CSIS here in Washington. Thanks again. I mean, this is very stimulating, as Brian said. I was wondering, as you've been carrying on your research, many of the programs that you're talking about, individual or beginnings of integrated work, are funded by donor organizations. And donor organizations, I think it's fair to say, despite best intentions, are also responsible for the silos. So what do you think are some of the key points that we need to take into consideration when we think, I think this is not going to happen organically necessarily, this integration, but what might donors and other funders do, to propel integration forward? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll take one third question, and then we go back to the panelists, and then we'll have another round. Please.
Hi, this is Wei Zhang with IFPRI. Very happy to see some of the old friends from Bridge. So my question is for Josh. I wonder if you could talk about whether Bridge has been able to draw some lessons about this component on capacity. What are the specific areas that you think we can help and strengthen and to increase our ability to work more collaboratively, whether it's mindset change or specific skills. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I'll pass right back to our panelists. Maybe Elizabeth, given the question on gender first.
Yeah, that was a great question. I think the difficulty in giving a 7-minute presentation is that you have to gloss over a lot of nuance, which is really important when you talk about gender. Certainly, when we talk about gender, we mean working with both men and women. There are lots of examples of good interventions that are now doing this. In fact, we had one last year on household dialogues. A lot of organizations, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, are doing these kinds of interventions where they work with couples together to work on strengthening understanding around and participation in budgeting and important household decisions. And this has to be done as a household. And of course, it also has to involve community members as well. So if there are certain harmful practices, getting community leaders as champions to encourage and catalyze change in the community is essential for that. So there's a lot of work that has to be done with everybody. And there are areas in which, men may be disadvantaged or boys may be disadvantaged. So bringing all of this together when we talk about gender and also all of the other intersectional issues related to age and ethnicity and marital status all have to be taken into account. So it gets, in a context, it gets much more specific and approaches to try to, I would say, facilitate positive social change should take all of these things into account. I think one of the reasons why there might be sort of a backlash to working on gender issues in some places is because people feel like our Western values maybe are being imposed in a certain context. And I think it's important that when we work with other communities, that we try to understand what local definitions and aspirations are about empowerment, and so that people themselves are trying to tell us where they want to go, and that the kind of work that we do only facilitates their own empowerment. We're not empowering anyone. People are empowering themselves, but we can facilitate that by giving them tools and interventions that support them.
Thank you. And I think we'll just go down, Catherine, Josh, and so basically we have the questions on the role of donors, and I think we have done quite a bit of analysis of that, and then also on the capacity needs to really to accelerate cross-sectoral collaboration. So I think those were the two main questions, but if you've heard a bit more in there, please.
Great.
Catherine.
So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the donor situation, because I completely concur with you that you have this push-pull thing going on with donors. And I guess what we've found is the people or the organizations that have been willing to start on some of these risky propositions are some of the smaller donors. So you're seeing the Rockefeller Foundation and other smaller organizations or funders that are sort of starting to think through these sorts of issues. And they're not doing it with very, very large grants. They're doing it with specific grants so that people can get some data around it. I mean, I think we all want to be driven by the evidence and not sort of just hope that, we try something new, a miracle occurs, and then we get the impact that we want, right? So really trying to think through some of those issues. I think also having some case studies is going to, of different types, and that's why we were trying to sort of get a sense like, there are going to be some research sorts of things. There are probably going to be some programmatic kinds of things. And we need to start to show that we can have more diverse kinds of outcomes, maybe faster, maybe better, and also maybe reducing negative externalities across sectors, right? And we know a lot about those negative externalities across sectors, particularly from the environmental sector. They know that very well. So trying to sort of speak to people in a language that makes sense, I think, is, maybe a beginning way to think about it. Josh, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd a bit. We've had some interesting sort of individual conversations with funders and also some sort of closed-door dialogues where we've tried to have really open, frank conversations, both with major funders who are still very clearly single sector and those that have moved more into integrated funding. And I think coming out of that, we've had two real insights that actually have led to how we set up this Bridge Spark Fund that we are currently running. The first is that there are way more teams out there with good ideas for integrated solutions than can access funding, getting very much to your question. And so we need to really better make the case, as Catherine was saying, for unlocking more resources to support cross-sector action. The flip side, though, which was really interesting for me, was recognizing that those funders who are already in the integrated space are not always able to find the teams they want to fund because the quality and the rigor of the proposals coming to them look somewhere between single sector or side-by-side ideas coming together versus truly integrated and transformative and higher expected impact. So there's a pipeline problem of teams and there's a dollars available problem. And so we have basically designed the Bridge Spark Fund in a way to try to address both. So the first phase is a pre-proposal, and what we are just entering now is a boot camp where we're going to work with 50 teams in a really intentional way to try and tie the pieces together around how do you deliver integrated impact across health, development, and environment, and critically, how do you think about potential for scaling of that idea in the first year of a project so it can lead to engage the right actors and have a mechanism to lead to bigger impact if successful. So we're trying to address that pipeline, and then in a modest way, we are unlocking resources directly focused on integrated solutions. But what we're trying to do is engage funders and other organizations in this process to think about ways that capacity building and more resources can be paired together so everyone is more confident and sort of excited about the pipeline of solutions coming forward.
Mm-hmm. Great. And that covered the capacity building question. Yeah, I think it was a good. Mm-hmm. Please, Lydia, something maybe, I think we've seen a lot of capacity building challenges starting out with the university systems that remain quite siloed in what they're teaching. Is that correct? Or as you come from a university?
Well, I think our university was brought in because we have kind of more integration than many other universities do. We already have a lot of interdisciplinary programs and research ongoing on the campus. But I think there's always a kind of a challenge in moving that forward, particularly to the education side. So getting the graduate students, it's usually the tenured faculty that have the bandwidth and ability to really get into the cross-sector applied work that we're talking about here today. And so I think it's trying to get younger students and faculty involved in that process. And so we are doing some trainings internally across campus and trying to figure out how do we advance that internally within the universities as well.
Okay, thank you. And Robin, any of these topics, gender, donors, capacity?
I can talk a little bit about how we're working within the framework of USAID. We're working within the current framework to look at the sort of levers and champions internally. And so USAID's their current agendas, their shifts, their language is shifting, their agenda is shifting. They're looking at collaborating, learning, and adapting more broadly. And so how do we link our integration actions to that agenda, and also adaptive management, and then so working within those systems that are looking at sort of innovative funding mechanisms that look at co-creation and how can you include cross-sector understanding and thinking in some of those co-creations, and then supporting that dialogue across the sectors to talk about measurement. So if you can still measure your single sector outcomes, but then what do you do? What are some of the indicators of the whole and how you're amplifying your development outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, excellent. Before we go back to the room, do we have any questions in the online audience?
Yes, we do have one question, and this person would like to remain anonymous. As Elizabeth mentioned, women are disadvantaged in productive asset ownership, inputs, education, access to services, and bargaining, among others. How is the Bridge Collaborative helping women realize these disadvantages so they can have a greater voice in agriculture, water management, and integrated development? And are there any other resources women can take advantage of?
Okay. I'd like to combine that question maybe with additional questions from the audience. Do we have any additional questions you would like to hear answered by our panel? Yes, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Oh, that's loud. I'm Stephanie Zobrist from PATH. Thank you all for a really great presentation. Fascinating panel. My question is for Robin. It was really interesting to hear you talk about the work of the USAID Bridge Project. I'm wondering if you could speak to one or two of the biggest challenges that you've all encountered in this work and how you've addressed them.
Okay, great. Do we have another question in the room? Okay, we have Rajul here.
Thank you very much. Rajul Pandya-Loch from IFPRI. I very much enjoyed these presentations, and I struggle with one word, and I'm wondering I struggle with the word integrated. And I'm wondering, as you have done this work, or as you're doing this work, have you analyzed or reviewed what integrated means? Are there is there a menu of options? When people talk about integrated, what are we proposing, suggesting? What works in terms of integration, or what doesn't work in terms of integration? Because I'm afraid that we will circle around this word in many different ways of understanding. But you were talking, Josh, about integration. We're siloed. And I kept on wondering, is it integration of people? Is it integration of institutions? Is it integration at the community level? Julie asked the question about donors, but I asked the question about adoption at the country level and the community level. There may not be an answer to this, but this is something I still struggle with in terms of what are we calling for when we talk about integrated? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I guess Elizabeth has the mic in her hand, so we'll start with you.
So in terms of the question about ways that we're addressing women's disadvantage, I mean, I think a lot of organizations are doing this differently. I think the Bridge Collaborative itself is really trying to look at a set of challenges to really make the case for integration, and obviously gender is a component in that. At IFPRI, we have a lot of projects where we develop tools, and like the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which is a good example of that, where we try to diagnose in a specific context what are the areas of disadvantage. It could be women's limited involvement in production decision making, or their lack of control over assets, or inability to access financial resources. And so our goal is to try and take this information that we learn through our research and inform the developing partners that we work with, who really are the ones on the ground making decisions in terms of programming and policy, so that those programs and policies are designed in a way that really meet women's needs in that particular case. I can add something on integration, but maybe I will okay. So I think, as was already said by the panelists here, a lot of times it is this kind of siloed effort where an organization will just look at each issue that they're supposed to be integrating in its own way without actually thinking through everything. We've done this with a few projects at IFPRI, like a project that we have working with IFAD right now, where they're actually trying to mainstream gender, youth, climate change, and nutrition in all of their activities and all of their missions. And I think they're going about it the right way. They're trying to integrate all of these issues into the design of their activities, into the monitoring, into all of the different efforts that are going on. And so we've been sort of supporting them in that effort so we kind of go in, you do a situation analysis, and you diagnose problems, and then you try to immediately design specifically to address all of those challenges, considering them simultaneously. And I think that considering them simultaneously is what is often missing. But I'm sure that the rest of the team can comment more on that.
Yeah, great. So maybe Robin first on the specific question, and then, given that integration is a broad question, we can ask all the remaining panelists. So maybe we'll do the specific question first to Robin on.
I think for our project, one of the biggest challenges has been the time frame for a project cycle to be able to achieve what we want to achieve. Collaborative processes take a lot of time. And so building the evidence base has been a big effort when you have multiple sectors involved and multiple minds involved. And so kind of getting that right and getting the right research methodology and the analysis, and then getting that to publication, and then using that evidence to start to influence programming, that's a whole nother cycle, right? So we can sort of achieve building the evidence base, but we can't always maybe see that through to programming. I think that's probably been the biggest challenge of our project. But on the other side, it's also been a good opportunity too, because it shows that integration does take time. Collaborative processes are really important. Building relationships are important, and then how you kind of navigate those barriers that we were talking about earlier and create the incentives for the programming is sort of the next phase, next step.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, Lydia?
Yeah, just to add one more thing on the integration question. So I think you're correct in, kind of how we've been thinking about it is this idea that there's interconnected issues and you might not always be considering those. So the unintended consequences, the potential co-benefits of your activities, and it's how do we make sure people are looking for those when they're working on projects and designing those projects, and how do we make sure that they have the right experts at the table to understand them. So it's trying to have teams recognize these issues and then reach out if they need to bring in experts to help them incorporate them into their projects and programs so that they're more kind of holistic in how they try to solve problems.
And I'll sort of acknowledge just the challenge of terminology generally right now. Integration is one of multiple words that you could have asked about, and one we certainly use. And I want to focus, I think, my response in terms of the primary focus for integration being around impact, in the sense that if you look at the changes, for example, the health community is trying to make, and the leading causes of poor health globally, the health sector cannot do its work alone. It needs to work fundamentally with food system change, with combating air pollution, combating climate change, and many other things to drive the change they need from a health perspective. And so I think the question is around impact, and what are we trying to achieve, and what is either potentially harmed by solutions in that set, or could potentially benefit, and to make sure we're doing the best we can across all the areas. And I think what, to achieve that though, if you sort of peel back, if we're saying we care about the end result, how we get there is quite an open question. And I would encourage us to be quite open to thinking about ways that any organization can already do better on its own. And I'll give an example from my home organization, the Nature Conservancy, where we still have a long journey to go, but we've really explicitly made our mission and our vision focused around benefiting people and nature together. Our history is in the environmental field and conservation strategies, but we are really looking more explicitly at how how advancing nature can help improve human well-being, human health in many aspects in the future. And I think there's ways that we are already trying to do better on our own, and also entering into partnerships like Bridge and others that help give us access to broader expertise, networks, and pathways to impact that were not available before. And so partnerships bring lots of costs and benefits to them. And I just want to emphasize, we don't always need to be partnering necessarily to deliver integrated impact. Sometimes, though, that is necessary, and certainly SDG 17 focuses on partnerships. But I think we need to be thinking and asking ourselves a hard question, wherever we are on that spectrum, how can we do more to deliver the kind of impact, and that impact is where integration ultimately lies.
Catherine, did you want to expand, or?
Yeah, sure. I just have one other comment, and I think this is a really great question because, we're not starting from scratch, but it's a paradigm shift, and it's shifting in the context of global mega changes that are happening right now. Climate change is happening, if you believe that. We're seeing that food systems, water issues, air pollution are the health issues or are going to drive many of the health issues of the 21st century. So sort of like, how do we think about that in the context of a new paradigm shift in terms of the way that we do business? And I think one of the things, one of the big lessons learned that we have is it's really hard to get people across sectors in the same room and talk about a shared interest or shared outcomes, because we use different vernaculars. Our perspectives, we're trained to look is slightly different. The way that we think about what is quality data varies from one sector to another. And really trying to get past those hurdles in terms of saying, like, okay, so what can we do even with that to make this work? And it's not always that easy. It's not always easy to know who the right person to call is. It's not always easy to understand what someone is really getting at when they're using similar concepts but different words to explain those concepts. And we put together, which is on the website, a sort of manual, kind of a how-to manual to kind of think about some of those issues. How do you judge data across sectors? How do you think about making sure that you're getting the right people in the room, and what does that look like? It doesn't give all the answers. I mean, there's sort of no right answers for that, but it helps at least think about what some of those issues are as we're beginning to try and change that paradigm.
Great. So yeah, also on this gender and inclusivity question, just quickly, Josh, how many submissions did we have for the Spark fund in total? If you could just remind us.
We had 257 submissions, which was a good number. Yeah.
And those are basically 257 teams. And even when they actually wrote this, concept note, they had to say how they think they're addressing inclusivity. And inclusivity could be gender inclusivity, or it could be a pro-poor focus, or ideally both. And so I think just by, so 275 teams, that means, 1,000 people, more or less. So basically, I think the way we're going out on that is really bringing it in every single time. And that's what we call also mainstreaming. And then we have tools available at different organizations. Obviously, we're trying to draw as broad and wide as feasible, and really focusing on the tools and having actually partners figuring out how they can actually implement it. This is just another point for the anonymous question online. So yeah, there's many approaches to do that, but in part we are trying it through these proposal process, the bootcamp process, and then obviously there will be a full proposal that will then be judged by actually funders and practitioners and researchers. So we'll have, again, an interdisciplinarity there. We hope to move that forward. And we're getting to the next round of questions from the room, but I'd also like to add my own question to Josh or the rest of the team. So when you did your presentation, you said one of the surprising results for the renewable energy challenge was that we often don't consider the substantial land and water resources that are potentially negatively impacted. Like renewables is one of those, it's perfect, we can't do anything wrong. So are there any other little surprises that you can think of while collecting the evidence for the report? I remember just recently you mentioned something on air pollution where I was really surprised about. So yeah, if you could maybe mention one or two of those additional surprises. But let's first go back into the room. There were a few more questions. Yes, please.
Julie Howard, CSIS. So apologies for the second question, but it was sparked by what Jewel and Catherine's observations about integrated. So I wonder, so I came into development, possibly working in Somalia on possibly the last standing integrated rural development project on the continent. And so I'm wondering, what you think is different now? What will we do differently now with this new flush of interest, important interest in integration? How is what we're doing and thinking about it now, how does that differ from what we were doing in the 70s and 80s?
Mm-hmm. Great. And I think we had a quick question there. And did we have one in the back too? Or yes, so we have two more questions. And then that means...
Just very quickly, but wanted to both say I thought Rajul's question was terrific, and Julie's point here is very much to the point. I'm also old enough to remember integrated rural development, integrated community development, population health and environment, the emergence of WASH. Previous calls have for integrated work have gotten hung up because of the complexity, the additional costs, the management challenges, the long duration. I'm sure we all have our favorite traumatic little experiences with integrated work, as compelling as the idea is for all of us. So it's really remarkable how intuitively compelling integration is as a notion, and yet how tough to get our arms around and how tough to justify to donors. You only need weight following a development of interest in integration for people to start saying, let's do a decomposition assessment on what you've bundled together so we can really address these issues individually and more efficiently and more quickly with sector specialists. So that's sort of the energy that drives the wheel. Hope we can keep this going with greater demonstration of the synergies and the cross-cutting co-benefits that we hope can come out of this. And that's on us to really tell the story and to tell the results analysis better. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we had one question in the back.
Hi, Julie Kurtz from IFPRI. I'm wondering, this may be a very naive question, with the integrated nature of this report, jumping from cultured proteins to gender work, how are you targeting how you promote the report? Who's your target audience? What do you expect? What is the expected or hoped for outcomes and objectives of that you hope your audience will do and respond? How do you hope they'll respond?
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so that will obviously definitely go to Josh among others. And we had two questions online that we'll just throw into that same mix here.
Okay, this one is from Rosa from Peru. How could we better understand the benefits of culture proteins, and are culture proteins a solution? And the second one is from K.M. Anamul Hok, Deputy Director of Campaign for Popular Education in Bangladesh. How do you evaluate living with dignity? Sometimes income transfers do not ensure dignity.
from me, of course, if you just get a transfer. And yeah. Good. So we'll go right back to the panel. So there is several questions from integrated rural development, the target audience, culture proteins, living with dignity if you get transfers, but maybe you're don't see a change in your own livelihood activities. And then there was obviously my own question on any surprises looking into this integration across, if you remember that graph that Josh showed, the integration across all of these SDGs. So what else, kind of was surprising? Yeah. So Josh has the mic, so he's starting.
Okay. Let me address a couple things here. So I'll just start with the surprises, and I will show that I am trained as a conservation scientist and have learned a lot through the process of being involved in Bridge and helping to lead it. And a couple things that have really struck me are around just the incredible quality of global health data from WHO and the Global Burden of Disease out of University of Washington, and our understanding of what causes poor health around the world and all the way down to countries and even subnational data in many cases. And so those link tightly, all the major health challenges link tightly to development and environmental issues. And learning that around 1 out of 8 or 9 or so people in the world die from air pollution, and that's very strongly tied back to fossil fuel use and to climate change. There are other factors, but that's the biggest one, is just really transformative. And we are seeing really interesting action around climate and health partnerships now that didn't even exist more than a couple of years ago. And I'll flag Healthcare Without Harm as one group that's doing really excellent work here and is trying to transform the health sector and mobilize more action for climate action directly. And I'll just quickly address the energy side as well, just to say that it's, in the environmental community, we think really detailed about what it means to be green. Clearly transitioning towards a low carbon future is an imperative as fast as possible. To be making sure that we're doing that in a way that delivers that kind of integrated impact that we're focused on, we have to recognize that solar can be placed in places that either can really harm biodiversity because it's in sensitive habitats that capture sun, or it can be placed on rooftops or on already human-used lands that are great places to capture the sun and support other benefits. And so how can we add that extra dimension to green? And I'm really sensitive to the comments, which are good, about we're not just trying to make life harder. And there's been a long history of this, so what's new? And so recognizing in part that this is old wine in new bottles, and that I think there are some different enabling conditions and focus. And I want to flag in particular the Sustainable Development Goals, a really powerful, if imperfect in many ways, framework that is driving a lot of attention around a more integrated approach and the kinds of changes needed for people, planet, and prosperity for all. And I'll flag UNDP, our partner on this report. One of the functions that they are serving for the SDGs going forward is as a, quote, integrator function. It's actually in the language of what they are asked to do as the agency. And they are specifically working with countries and other stakeholders to look at how to develop integrated plans for achieving multiple SDGs. So I think recognizing that there's a lot of lessons learned and we're not just trying to make things complicated. At the same time, I think this broader global framework and commitments of actors to think more holistically is a stronger enabling condition now, and very much what this report, to address the audience, very much what this report is focused on is how do we drive progress for the SDGs. We know this information, how do we put it together in a way that can allow actors to work together more effectively?
Okay, so on the target audience, so you kind of said something about it, but can you be a tiny bit more specific? Who do you think should read that? Apart from all of you in the room, because you came to the seminar, right. Who else? Is it university students? Is it practitioners who want to do integrated rural development again? Or is it we know we might not want to go back to integrated rural development, but we want to do something in between single sector and integrated rural development? Yeah, who should be reading this?
Yeah, so I think definitely university students. I hope they will read this. And we have some pathways to that, thanks to Lydia and others. I think there it's really about a mindset shift of how to define problems in a different way than decades ago training was. I think, though, this report is not a research advance per se. So this report is not oriented towards the research community per se in the sense of advancing knowledge. We are synthesizing existing knowledge, which is already out there in new ways. And so what we really hope this report is used and read by is UNDP and the countries that they're working with at the ministry level, where we can understand where the Ministry of Health should be working in tighter partnership with the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Finance on ways to deliver more cost-effective solutions for the country's goals for SDGs. To be looking at groups like represented by us here with the Nature Conservancy on environment, Path on health, and our peers around the world who are implementing programs in the field and are specifically trying to understand how they can go farther. What is holding them up that is a cross-sector issue, and how can they make sure they're not doing harm in ways that they don't intend to? So I think those are more specifically the kinds of audiences that we are targeting with this report.
Okay, thank you. So we pass on to Catherine on proteins with a question from Peru, and any other interventions related to the living with dignity, integrated rural development programs. So any of the other interventions you would like to comment on, but mostly on the protein question.
So I'll start with that. So one of the this grant that we have from the Rockefeller Foundation, I talked about two components: a market analysis and the policy regulatory environment. But there's a whole nother section that's really looking at predictive analytics around the health, agriculture, and environmental impacts of these new production technologies and the resulting proteins. And so we'll have a sense of what some of those impacts are, and we're excited by the work because we're going to be actually using the same set of criteria as much as possible to run those different sets of analyses. So really trying to get the researchers in the room together to sort of think through what does this look like so that we can, try to think about them being in a pretty unified approach. We're also trying to get a handle on what some of the issues are around GMOs, and that's less of an issue in terms of health impact because the cultured proteins will they'll actually spin the catalyst out, so there will be no GMO in the product. But we know that that's a consumer issue and will relate to demand, and we'll have some issues around uptake related to that. So trying to get some consumer perceptions in there as well. And then another issue that people have brought up is what will the impact on smallholder farmers be? And we know there's another person who's actually looking specifically at that issue. It's a hard one to gauge right now because these things are pretty far off in terms of large scale. So we know that the market for these early on will likely be in developed countries in high income markets. And we know that, there are things that are going to be countered in terms of population growth and increasing income and demand for these sorts of things, as well as a whole host of other potential products that are going to be on the market. Part of the report we just did, we saw a 24% increase in 1 year for milk substitutes, plant-based milk substitutes. So this is something, a really big trend that's happening in many, many places. And so, we're increasingly trying to get a handle on what that looks like through some of these predictive analytics, recognizing that, as the market continues to grow for these, we'll need to take a more closer look with better data.
Okay, great. So any additional contributions to this, what I believe is the last round of questions? So we have the. Okay.
Sorry. Just a quick comment on the sort of rural development. I come from an integrated conservation and development background, and so 20 years ago, that's what the type of projects that I was working on the ground. And what I see as a difference now versus then is that those were implemented by conservationists with money from donors, very focused on conservation actions, but it was looking at alternative livelihoods. It was looking at health. It was looking at building schools, done by conservationists. It wasn't bringing in other expertise. It wasn't including other line agencies. So beekeeping activities and crafts weren't looking at market feasibility or value chain viability and market access in general, because they weren't economic growth experts. They were really conservation experts. And I think in some degrees as well, with some of the rural development projects too, that they were a bit more of generalists, but still having that very specific technical expertise that can come in and help make a project, link up with the right places and the right line agencies, like the ministries of health and education, that need to be included in when you build a school and there's no one inside and there's no funding for putting desks in the school. I think that was, and also I think as funding streams have become a lot more defined, the technical approach has become a lot more narrow. And so those outcomes are very specific to that funding stream. And that's what, Congress wants to see. They want to see how do we respond to that funding stream? And so kind of going back to us, or the way that we're looking at, what are the indicators of the greater whole, even if you are needing to respond to your specific funding stream. So that's how integration looks a little bit different to me anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I don't sense any urgent questions in the room, and I would therefore like to give a last word to each of our panelists. So, based on everything you've heard and, everything obviously you're doing in your daily life, what is the one big message in relation to bigger change faster, really towards achieving the SDGs? So what do you want to leave the audience with? So just one quick statement, and really just think out of the box. Feel free to think out of the box anyway. Thanks.
Well, I'll piggyback on what was just talked about, because I think one of the great things that the Bridge Collaborative has done is to really cultivate a community of practice around integration and bring different experts together. Because I think traditionally, people are more comfortable sticking in the area where they have a particular area of knowledge or expertise. And often, even if they want to do integration, even if they think it's a good idea, they may not know who to reach out to and who to partner with. And so I think what the Bridge Collaborative has done is to really develop that community and develop that network and strengthen those ties. And I think they're continuing to do that. And so I think going forward, I think that's one way that we can really move towards integration, is integrating teams and talking to different experts and learning from them and not being afraid to go outside of your comfort zone.
Thank you. Okay, Catherine?
Yeah, I guess I would just put a plug in for early career professionals and mentorship, because I think as paradigms are shifting, we're leaving a whole host of new kinds of problems for a generation that needs to have new ways to deal with them. And just, I think your comment was so great, saying like, 30 years ago when we were doing this, like what's different today? And I think that kind of wisdom coupled with energy and renewed understanding of the way that problems can be solved, with access to things that we didn't have in our generation. Lots of new IT, different kinds of thinking, much easier way to understand what's going on from information, access to information and that sort of thing. So I put a plug in for that because I get a phone call about every month from a student who's asking, saying like, wow, I really would, I'm really interested in the work you're doing and I really love to come and work with you. And I can't accommodate all of them. So it's going to be people in this room who are on the forefront, who are thinking about these issues and who really want genuinely to make a change. Help a young person, have the advantage of being able to do that.
Great, thank you. Josh?
Yeah, and I'll really sort of double down on what's been said already and add to that I think we're in a position in each of our organizations to ask the simple but not easily answered question, what can our organization do better? And that can be directly related to our mission, to ask hard questions about, to achieve our mission, can we do this on our own, as we have generally been doing, or are there dependencies to other sectors and other communities that are necessary to address? So how do we then look from our mission down to the strategic priorities of the organization to really say who needs to be brought in? How do we bring in other experts and other partner organizations to reduce those transaction costs to get the knowledge and the revised strategies that can really deliver the bigger change? And I think that question, this doesn't need to be always huge partnerships. Sometimes that's necessary, but really being clear on what our organization can do better on its own collectively, I think could make a lot of progress from where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Great. Lydia.
So 2 quick points. First, I think the Bigger Change Faster report, I think one of the key things from my perspective is this idea that under the SDGs, there's everything we could partner on. Like there's intersections everywhere. Where do we start? And I feel like the Bigger Change Fast report helps us focus in on some key priorities that are priorities across all of the sectors. And so they're a place where we can focus and build our collaborations together and try to have impact as a community. The second thing is going back to what we can do at a university. So one of the things that I think would be great is to bring some of these methods that are used, situational analysis, other approaches, into the university setting. It's not typically used in academics at all to use those kinds of methods to think through problems. And I also would love to find a way to pull together university teams of students and faculty to help solve these challenges. So we can bring experts together at the universities really easily. And so if having a cross-expert team help think through problems and design solutions, that's a great setting to do that. And there are kinds of examples like that around universities, but I think we should do it more towards these development challenges than we currently do. Mostly it's engineering type solutions.
Thank you. And finally, Robin, please.
Thank you. I think from the institutional level, it's the big impact is develop champions, identify champions, get together with champions, start the dialogue, get the conversation going, and really learn the other sector's language too. What drives that sector? What's their interest, and where do you see those areas of intersect? And then I think one other point that hasn't come up so much in our work, but I see it happening with the case study examples and through this report, is really understanding what a community person's lens looks like. And that's the sort of a point of integration as well, because obviously they don't see their lives in silos and in single sectors. And so, I mean, I think that having an opportunity to really get local people into this conversation and to start to define what integration looks like from that perspective is also another positive start.
Great. And on that great notes, with all these messages that I hope you will take forward, I'd like to close today's policy seminar. Thanks again for coming. Thank you.